Chapter 1. Samuel Brennan knelt beside the narrow cot, his calloused hand pressed against his daughter's forehead. The heat radiating from Emma's skin made his chest tighten. 8 years old and small for her age, she lay tangled in quilts, shivering, despite the fire crackling in the stone hearth. "Mama," Emma murmured. Eyes closed. "Where's Mama?" Samuel's throat constricted. "Hush now. Little bird, rest." Wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters he'd repaired last autumn. Snow piled against the door in drifts that would reach his waist by morning. The Montana winter had sealed them in, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, 6 from the settlement. The lamp on the rough-hewn table flickered, oil running low, like everything else. He rose and moved to the open shelves that served as their pantry, 3 jars of preserves, a sack of cornmeal, half full, salt pork wrapped in cloth, and the medicine shelf, empty except for a bottle of castor oil and some dried sage. Nothing for fever. Nothing that would help. Samuel crossed to the woodpile beside the hearth. He counted the split logs with a practiced eye. 3 days. Maybe 4 if he rationed carefully. The forest beyond their claim stood thick with timber, but the blizzard made cutting impossible. Every breath outdoors burned the lungs. Emma coughed, a wet rattling sound that sent ice through his veins. He'd heard that cough before, 2 winters ago, when Catherine had taken to bed with the second baby coming early. The midwife had been snowed in, unable to reach them. By the time the roads cleared, it was too late for both of them. He couldn't lose Emma, too. Samuel returned to her side and dipped a cloth in the water basin. The water was cold, pulled from the pump that morning before the storm hit. He wrung it out and laid it across Emma's forehead. She whimpered, but didn't wake. "I'm here," he whispered. "Papa's here!" The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Samuel fed it another log, watching his supply dwindle. Tomorrow he'd have to ride to town, storm or no storm. The doctor kept tonics and powders. Samuel had no money. But maybe Doc Harrison would accept a promise of payment. Maybe he'd take pity. The word tasted bitter. Pride had kept Samuel going these 2 years. Pride in his claim. His daughter. His ability to provide. But pride wouldn't save Emma's life. He settled into the chair beside her cot, pulling his coat tighter. The cabin felt colder than it should, despite the fire. Or maybe the cold came from inside him, spreading outward from the hollow place Catherine's death had carved. Emma's breathing grew labored as midnight approached. Samuel rested his hand on her small chest, feeling it rise and fall, too fast, too shallow. "Hold on, little bird," he said to the darkness. "Just hold on till morning." Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the lamp guttered low. Samuel watched his daughter burn with fever, and made his calculations. He had calloused hands from 2 years of working this claim alone. He had fierce love for the child sleeping fitfully before him. He had 3 days of firewood, and no money. He prayed it would be enough. Morning came gray and bitter. Samuel stood at the window, staring at the white expanse beyond. The storm had eased but not broken. Snow still fell in lazy spirals, adding to drifts that buried the fence posts. He'd saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, determined to ride for town. But Emma's fever had spiked again, and he couldn't leave her alone. Not like this. So he'd unsaddled the gelding and returned to the cabin, trapped by weather and circumstance. Now he split wood behind the cabin, trying to stretch their supply. The axe bit into frozen pine, each swing an act of desperation. His breath clouded white. His fingers ached despite heavy gloves. Hoofbeats. Samuel straightened, axe lowering. Through the falling snow, a figure emerged, a rider on a sturdy mare. saddlebags heavy on both sides. As the rider drew closer, Samuel recognized the dark coat and practical wide-brimmed hat. Grace Porter, the widow from 6 miles south. She reined in beside the cabin, her weathered face framed by gray-streaked brown hair. Somewhere near 40. Samuel guessed. Though frontier life made age hard to reckon, her eyes were steady and measuring. "Heard your daughter's taken sick," Grace said without preamble. "Tom at the general store mentioned it when I picked up supplies yesterday." Samuel gripped the axe handle. "News travels. In small measure." Grace dismounted with easy competence. "May I see her?" Pride flared hot in Samuel's chest. "I can't pay you. Mrs. Porter, adoreste che. Did I ask you to—" Grace pulled the saddlebags free and slung them over her shoulder. "Hey, your door locked. Or can I walk in?" Samuel's jaw worked. Emma coughed inside, the sound carrying through the cabin walls. He looked at the widow's steady expression, at the saddlebags that likely held more medicine than he'd seen in 2 years. "Door's open," he said quietly. Grace entered without ceremony. Samuel followed, watching as she set the bags on the table and moved directly to Emma's cot. She laid a hand on the girl's forehead, checked her pulse, lifted each eyelid gently. How long?" Grace asked. 2 days. Fever came on fast." Grace nodded and returned to her saddlebags. She unpacked with practiced efficiency cloth pouches of dried herbs, small bottles of tincture, a mortar and pestle. The scents of willow bark and chamomile filled the cabin. "I'll need hot water," Grace said, "and a clean cloth for straining." Samuel moved to comply, filling the kettle from the water barrel. He hung it over the fire and retrieved Catherine's tea towels from the chest. "Ciao, bulaiso." When he turned back, Grace was grinding willow bark, her movements sure and unhurried. "Mrs. Porter." "Grace?" "Grace." Samuel set the cloth beside her. "I meant what I said. I don't have money for medicine. The claim barely feeds us. I can't. My cabin needs firewood cut and stacked before the real spring thaw." Grace interrupted, meeting his eyes. "The roof's got a leak over the bedroom. The fence along the north pasture is half fallen, and I'm a widow alone with no sons to do the heavy work." Samuel stared at her. "I'll tend your daughter." Grace continued. "You'll tend my homestead. Fair trade between neighbors." That's not Samuel's voice caught. "That's charity dressed up." "It's barter," Grace said firmly. "I need what you can provide, same as you need what I can. Your hands are strong and your back straight. That's currency here. Same as coins." She paused, softening slightly. "Unless your pride matters more than your daughter's health." The words struck like a physical blow. Samuel looked at Emma, at her flushed cheeks and labored breathing, then back at Grace's weathered, patient face. "What do I do?" he asked, surrendering. "Right now, pour that water when it boils." Grace returned to her grinding. "Then tomorrow morning, you ride to my place and start on that wood pile. I'll stay here and tend Emma." Samuel nodded, throat too tight for words. The kettle began to steam. The willow bark tea smelled bitter. Grace strained it through the cloth. Let it cool slightly, then lifted Emma's head with gentle hands. The girl woke enough to swallow, grimacing at the taste. "I know, sweetheart," Grace murmured, "but it'll help the fever." Emma's eyes drifted to Samuel, standing uncertain near the hearth. "Papa." "I'm here, little bird." Grace lowered Emma back to the pillow and dampened another cloth with cool water. She folded it precisely and laid it across the girl's forehead. Her movements carried the confidence of long practice. "You've done this before." Samuel said, "I tended the sick." Grace glanced at him. "Most of my life. My mother was a healer, taught me herbs and remedies before I could write my name. The settlement must keep you busy." Busy enough." Grace checked Emma's pulse again. "Though I've no formal training, just what Mama taught me and what I've learned since." Samuel fed the fire, grateful for something to occupy his hands. The cabin felt different with Grace in it, fuller somehow, though she took up little space. Not like when Catherine had been alive, all laughter and quick movements. Grace's presence was quieter, steadier. "Your wife," Grace said, not looking at him. "Tom mentioned she passed. I'm sorry." Samuel's hand stilled on the poker. 2 winters back, she and the baby both childbirth. The baby came early. I rode for the midwife. But the storm. He stopped, the memory still sharp. By the time I got back, Catherine was bleeding bad. Nothing I did helped. The baby. A boy. He never even cried. Grace was quiet a moment. "I'm sorry," she said again. And her tone carried the weight of someone who knew grief firsthand. "But your husband?" and Samuel asked. "Mining accident. 3 years ago this spring." Grace adjusted Emma's blankets. "Cave-in at the Richardson claim. Jacob and 2 others didn't make it out." They stood in silence. 2 people acquainted with loss. Outside, the wind had gentled. Snow fell soft now, no longer driven by storm fury. Grace began explaining the tea recipe as she prepared another dose. "Willow bark for fever and pain. Steep it in water just off the boil. Let it sit 5 minutes. Strain well, the bark itself can upset the stomach." Her hands moved as she spoke, teaching. "Yarrow helps too, for bringing down fever, and chamomile soothes." Samuel listened, committing each instruction to memory. A man who can learn is never poor. The phrase drifted through his mind. Something his own father had said during lean times. "How often?" and he asked. "Every 4 hours while the fever's high. Watch her breathing and her color. If either changes sharp, brew it stronger." Emma slept fitfully, her small face peaceful between the bouts of restlessness. Grace hummed as she worked an old hymn Samuel half recognized. The sound filled the cabin like warmth, settling into corners that had been cold and silent too long. "I should see to my horse," Grace said eventually. "She'll need rubbing down and feed." "I'll do it." Samuel reached for his coat. "You've done enough already." "Then I'll start supper. You have cornmeal. And salt pork." Grace smiled slightly. "I'll make it stretch." Outside, Samuel led Grace's mare to the small lean-to that served as a stable. His own gelding nickered a greeting. The mare was well-built and sure-footed, the kind of horse that suited a woman who rode alone through frontier winters. He rubbed her down thoroughly, gave her feed and water, then stood a moment in the cold. The storm was ending. Through breaking clouds, late afternoon sun slanted golden across the snow. The world looked clean and new, washed by weather. When Samuel returned to the cabin, the smell of cornbread baking greeted him. Grace had Emma propped slightly upright, spooning broth between her lips. The girl swallowed weakly but kept it down. "Better," Grace said, meeting Samuel's eyes. "She's holding food." Relief crashed through him so hard his knees weakened. He steadied himself against the door frame. "Get yourself together. Grace said, not unkindly. Then sit. You need to eat too. That evening, after Emma had taken more medicine and drifted into deeper sleep, Samuel and Grace sat at the table. The cornbread was simple, but good. The pork fried crisp. They ate in comfortable silence. Tomorrow, Grace said, you'll ride to my place. The woodshed is behind the cabin. You'll see where the stack needs building. Cut what you can. And we'll call the first day's trade made. Samuel nodded. I'll start at first light. See that you do. Grace rose and began cleaning the dishes. And Samuel. He looked up. Your daughter will live, Grace said quietly. But she needs careful tending for a while yet. I'll stay as long as necessary. The crack in Samuel's chest widened, not breaking but opening, letting in the first breath of hope he'd felt in 2 days. Maybe longer. Thank you, he managed. Grace's expression softened. We help each other out here. That's how we survive. Morning came with the first dose of medicine in Emma's system, and Samuel saddling his horse for Grace's homestead. The bargain was struck. The work was beginning. So was something else a thaw in the ice around Samuel's heart. The first week unfolded in rhythms that became familiar. Samuel rose before dawn, checked on Emma, then rode the 6 miles to Grace's cabin. The work was hard but honest, felling trees, splitting logs, stacking cord after cord in her woodshed. Grace's homestead sat in a small valley, sheltered from the worst winds. The cabin was neat and well kept, with a garden plot marked out for spring planting and a root cellar built into the hillside. The property showed a woman's practicality and a widow's determination. Samuel worked until his shoulders ached and his hands blistered beneath the gloves. He cut enough wood to see Grace through next winter and halfway into the one beyond. The physical labor felt good, purposeful and clean. Each evening he returned to his own cabin to find Emma improved. Grace's medicines worked steadily. The fever came and went, but never spiked as dangerously as that first night. Emma began sitting up for short periods, taking broth and bread, even smiling weakly when Samuel entered. Papa, she said on the 4th evening. Voice thin but clear. Where do you go? Helping Mrs. Porter, Samuel said, settling beside her cot. She's helping us, so I help her back. Emma's eyes drifted to where Grace stood at the hearth, stirring something fragrant in the pot. She makes good soup. Grace glanced over, a smile tugging her weathered face. My mother's recipe. Chicken and wild onion. It's better than Papa's, Emma said with a child's honesty. Samuel laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. That's a low bar to clear. Little bird. The evenings became teaching moments. Grace showed Samuel how to identify useful herbs, how to dry them properly, how to measure doses. He learned the difference between feverfew and chamomile, between yarrow and sage. Knowledge passed hand to hand, like something precious. Most folks think healing is complicated, Grace said one night, grinding dried leaves in her mortar. But it's mostly attention, watching close and responding to what you see, like ranching. Samuel offered, reading your stock. Exactly like that. Grace added a pinch of the powder to hot water. Everything tells you what it needs. If you listen. They shared meals in the evening, simple fare cooked on Samuel's hearth, eaten at his rough table. Grace proved capable in the kitchen, turning meager supplies into satisfying suppers. She moved through the cabin with easy efficiency, never overstepping, but filling spaces Samuel hadn't realized were empty. On the 6th day, Samuel rode to the settlement for supplies. Tom Carter behind the general store counter gave him a knowing look. "Heard the widow's tending your girl," Tom said, "weighing out cornmeal." "She is." Samuel kept his voice neutral. "Heard you're working her place in trade." "I am." Tom's grin was sly. "Convenient arrangement." Samuel met the storekeeper's eyes steadily. "It's honest work for honest help. Nothing more." But riding back through the cold afternoon, provisions tied behind his saddle, Samuel wondered if that was entirely true. Grace's presence had changed something in his cabin and himself. The loneliness that had hollowed him since Catherine's death felt less absolute. Not filled. Exactly, but less empty. That evening, Grace taught him to repair a split seam in Emma's quilt. Her hands guided his through the stitching, patient with his clumsy attempts. "There," she said when he'd finished the patch. "Good as new." Their fingers brushed as she took the quilt back. Neither pulled away quickly. The moment hung between them, noted but not acknowledged. Emma slept peacefully now, her breathing even and unlabored. The worst of the fever had broken 2 days ago. Soon, she'd be well enough that Grace could return to her own cabin. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, Samuel felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. The fence at my place," Grace said. "Breaking the quiet. You'll start on that tomorrow." "First thing." Samuel agreed. "Good." And Grace rose and banked the fire for the night. The north pasture is where it's worst. Posts rotted through last summer. She'd brought a bedroll and slept near the hearth. Close enough to tend Emma if needed. Samuel took his own bed in the loft, listening to the cabin settle around them. For the first time in 2 years, the space didn't feel oppressively lonely. Outside, the first icicle fell from the eaves, shattering on frozen ground with a sound like breaking glass. The thaw was coming. Subtle but inevitable. Neither of them heard it over the crackling fire. The second week brought warmer days. Not spring yet, but the promise of it sun stronger. Snow softening, icicles dripping steady music from the roof. Emma's improvement became undeniable. She sat up without help, asked for books, complained about staying in bed. Grace declared these signs of healing, and allowed the girl short periods in the rocking chair by the fire. "Martin, don't overdo," Grace cautioned. "Fever broke, but you're still weak." "I'm tired of this cot," Emma protested. "You'll be more tired if the fever comes back." But Grace's tone was gentle, even amused. Samuel watched them from the doorway, tools in hand for another day's work at Grace's homestead. The scene struck him with unexpected force, his daughter animated and arguing, a woman's patient correction. Domestic peace. "Mind Mrs. Porter," he told Emma. "I'll be back by supper. Bring rabbit if you can." Grace called after him. "There's meat enough for stew." He did bring rabbit, 2 fat ones shot on the ride home. Grace skinned and cleaned them with practiced efficiency, showing Emma how to prepare the vegetables that would simmer alongside the meat. You press the knife away from yourself," Grace explained, guiding Emma's small hands. "Oh, always away, so if it slips, you don't cut toward your body." Emma absorbed the lesson with serious concentration. Samuel cleaned his rifle at the table, half listening to their conversation. The domesticity of it settled around him like a warm coat. That night, Emma's fever spiked unexpectedly. Not dangerously high, but enough to worry. Grace worked quickly fresh tea, cool compresses, careful monitoring. Samuel hovered uselessly until Grace assigned him tasks: more water from the pump, clean cloths, stoking the fire. Near midnight, Emma's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Grace with sudden clarity. Will you stay?" Emma asked. Voice small. "After I'm better." Grace's composure wavered. Her hand stilled on Emma's forehead, and something shifted in her weathered face. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "As long as you need me, sweetheart." Samuel stood in the doorway, watching. The lamplight caught the sheen of unshed tears in Grace's eyes. In that moment, he understood she was lonely too. The capable widow with her healing skills and practical efficiency. She'd been alone, as long as he had, filling the void with work and purpose. His heart cracked open another degree. Emma drifted back to sleep, and Grace rose to prepare more tea. Samuel moved to help, and they worked side by side in the quiet cabin. Their movements had become coordinated. Over the days he anticipated what she needed. She adapted to his rhythms. "Your wife," Grace said softly, pouring water. "What was her name?" "Catherine." The name came easier now, without the sharp edge of fresh grief. She was quick to laugh, loved planting things, flowers mostly. Though the frontier's hard on flowers. What did she plant? Roses, wild ones from the foothills. Samuel smiled at the memory. Never took properly. But she kept trying. Grace nodded, stirring the steeping tea. Jacob used to sing. Terrible voice, but he sang anyway. Welsh hymns his grandfather taught him. They stood together, honoring the dead without being haunted by them. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. "I've been alone a long time," Grace said eventually. "Me too." She looked at him then. Really looked. And Samuel held her gaze. Something passed between them. Recognition. Maybe. Understanding that loneliness recognized loneliness. The work at my place." Grace said, "You've done more than the trade required." The fence needed it. It did? She poured the tea, measured the dose carefully. Still, "You could have done less?" Samuel didn't reply. The truth was, he'd been finding excuses to extend the work, to stretch the arrangement. The thought of Grace leaving, of the cabin returning to its hollow quiet, had become unbearable. The next day, he repaired Grace's leaky roof under uncertain skies. Clouds massed and broke. Then, unexpectedly, a single beam of sunlight cut through, warming his shoulders as he worked. Samuel paused, hammer in hand, and looked toward his own cabin 6 miles north. The warmth on his back felt like grace itself, unearned, unexpected, possibly undeserved. He didn't know if he was ready for spring, for hope, for the possibility that life might offer second chances. But ready or not, the season was turning. The third week began with disaster. Emma's fever had been manageable for days, low grade, easily controlled with Grace's medicines. Then, on a night when the wind picked up again, and temperatures dropped, it spiked viciously. Samuel woke to Grace moving frantically around the cabin, brewing stronger tea, preparing cold compresses, her usual calm efficiency replaced by sharp urgency. "How high?" he asked, pulling on his shirt. "Too high." Grace's jaw was tight. "Help me get these compresses changed." They worked together through the dark hours. Emma thrashed, delirious. calling for her mother in a voice that tore at Samuel's chest. He held his daughter's hand while Grace forced medicine between her lips, bathed her burning skin, whispered prayers Samuel could barely hear. Dawn came gray and cold. Emma's fever hadn't broken. "I don't understand," Grace said, exhaustion cracking her voice. "The willow bark should work. It's worked all week." Samuel stared at his daughter's flushed face. The terror he'd held at bay came roaring back, the memory of Catherine slipping away, of the baby who never drew breath, of loss compounding until it crushed him. What else can we try?" he demanded. "I've tried everything." Grace's hand shook as she wrung out another compress. "Everything I know." Samuel stood abruptly, the chair scraping harsh against the floorboards. He paced to the window, stared at the gray morning, fists clenching. 2 years of holding together, of surviving, of providing, and for what he couldn't even afford proper medicine from a real doctor. "I should ride for town," he said. "Get the doctor here." "In this weather? That's a 5-hour round trip." "Samuel, and what will you pay him with?" The question detonated something inside him. Samuel spun, rage and shame and terror boiling over. "I don't know." The words came harsh, too loud. "I don't have money. I don't have anything. I can't even pay for medicine that might save my daughter's life." "What kind of father?" His voice broke. "What kind of man can't provide for his own child?" "Samuel." "No." He shook his head violently. "It's true. I've got a worthless claim that barely feeds us. A cabin that leaks. Nothing to trade but my hands. And my hands can't fix this." Grace stood slowly. Her weathered face was hard, her eyes fierce. "Your hands built this cabin," she said, voice low and steady. "Your hands kept your daughter fed and warm for 2 years alone. Your hands are mending my fence and chopping my wood and learning healing because you're willing to do whatever it takes. It's not enough. You're here." Grace cut him off, stepping closer. "When Emma wakes frightened, you're here. When she needs water or comfort or someone to read her stories, you're here. You think worth is measured in coins. It's not. It's measured in presence, in showing up day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Samuel stared at her, chest heaving. "You're not Atlas," Grace continued. "Quieter now. You don't carry the sky alone. That's why we make bargains, why we trade, why we help each other survive this hard country." She paused. "The kind of father you are, the kind who's here, the kind who's fighting. That's everything." The words hit like hammer blows, each one cracking the shell of shame and pride Samuel had built around himself. He wanted to argue, to insist she was wrong. But exhaustion and fear had stripped him down to raw truth. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so scared of losing her." "I know." And Grace's expression softened. "But fear doesn't mean you're failing. It means you love her." Outside, the wind gentled. Inside, Emma's breathing stayed labored, her fever unchanged. But something had shifted between the two adults keeping vigil. Samuel returned to his daughter's bedside. Grace brewed more tea with hands that had stopped shaking. "I'm sorry," Samuel said after a while. "For shouting. Don't be." Grace brought the tea over. "Sometimes we need to break before we can heal." They worked through the day in tense silence, monitoring Emma's every breath, The fever remained high but didn't climb higher. Small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. That evening, as darkness fell again, Samuel looked across Emma's cot at Grace's exhausted face. She'd been fighting for his daughter as hard as he had. Not for payment. Not for trade. Because she cared. Thank you, he said, for not giving up on us. Grace met his eyes. I told you before I'm lonely too. You think I'm just here for Emma? She shook her head slightly. I'm here because I haven't felt needed in 3 years. Because this cabin feels more like home than my own. Because... She stopped, seeming to catch herself. Because... Samuel prompted gently. Grace looked away. Because maybe we're helping each other more than just the trade. The admission hung in the warm air between them. Outside. The temperature had risen slightly. The worst of the cold snap was passing. So was something else, some barrier neither had been willing to name. Samuel sat alone in the darkest hours, Grace finally sleeping in her bedroll after 2 days of constant vigilance. Emma's fever had stabilized, not broken, but no longer climbing. The crisis had passed. Barely. He watched his daughter's face in the firelight, 8 years old, all he had left of Catherine. The thought of losing her had paralyzed him with terror, but Grace's words kept circling back. Worth isn't measured in coins. It's measured in presence. Samuel had spent 2 years defining himself by what he'd lost: wife, child, the future he'd imagined, and by what he lacked: money, security, the ability to control outcomes. He'd measured worth in provisions he could stockpile and land he could claim. But what had any of that mattered when Emma fell sick? His calloused hands had learned healing. His pride had been enough to accept help. His isolation had cracked to let someone in. Those were the things that had saved his daughter. Not coins or claims. Samuel bowed his head and prayed. Not for miracles this time. Not for divine intervention to spare him more loss. Instead, he prayed for wisdom to see what he had, rather than what he lacked. For grace to accept help without shame. For courage to build something new from grief's ruins. The fire popped softly. Wind had died completely. The cabin sat in profound stillness. When dawn broke, it brought the first true warmth of early spring. Samuel felt it immediately. A shift in the air's quality. He rose and opened the door. No wind struck him. Snow on the ground had begun melting in earnest, revealing patches of brown earth. Emma stirred. Samuel moved to her cot quickly, pressing his palm to her forehead. Cool. Not cold, but distinctly cooler than yesterday. Grace. He called softly. Grace. Wake up. I ended there. The widow came alert instantly. Years of frontier life training, quick responses. She joined him at Emma's side and checked for herself. The fever's dropping, she confirmed, voice thick with relief and exhaustion. Finally dropping. They looked at each other across Emma's sleeping form. Grace's hair had come loose from its practical bun, gray-streaked strands framing her weathered face. Her eyes were red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Samuel imagined he looked equally rough. Thank you, he said. Not just for Emma, for... He struggled for words. For showing me I'm not alone. Grace's expression softened into something tender. She reached across and took his hand, her fingers rough from years of work. Neither am I, she said quietly. The moment stretched, gentle and profound. Then Emma shifted, and they released hands, returning to the practical work of caregiving. But something had fundamentally changed. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully for the first time in days, Samuel and Grace worked together grinding herbs for the next batch of medicine. The pestle's rhythmic sound filled the cabin, domestic, companionable. "Your fence is finished," Samuel said, "and the roof's sound. I could start on the pasture gate if you want." "The trade's complete." "Samuel, more than complete." "I know." He met her eyes. "But I'd like to do it anyway." Grace studied him. "Oh, wait, because I don't want this to end. Because your presence has filled something in me I didn't know was empty. Because when I imagine this cabin without you in it, the loneliness returns like winter cold. Because you've done so much for us." Samuel said instead, "Seems only fair." Grace's lips quirked in a small smile. "Fair," she echoed. "Well then, the gate could use work." They returned to grinding herbs, and their hands brushed as Samuel reached for the mortar. Neither pulled away. The contact was brief but deliberate acknowledgement of something neither quite had words for yet. It had chunnoy. Outside, icicles dripped steady music, the sound of thaw, of ice surrendering to warmth. Inside, Emma asked weakly for broth and managed a smile when Grace brought it to her. "You're getting better, sweetheart," Grace said, helping her sit up. "Are you going home soon?" Emma asked. Grace glanced at Samuel. "I don't know. Maybe Angosse." "I hope you don't," Emma said with a child's simple honesty. "It's nicer when you're here." Samuel's throat tightened. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she held the cup. "We'll see," was all Grace said. That night. Samuel lay in his loft listening to the cabin settle. Grace's soft breathing near the hearth, Emma's peaceful sleep, the fire's gentle crackle. Sounds of home rather than mere survival. The worst had passed. His daughter would live. Spring was breaking winter's grip. And somehow, in the midst of crisis, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever. The possibility of family. Not the one he'd had, but something new, something built from choice and care rather than blood alone. Morning would come with its own challenges. But for now, in the darkness, Samuel allowed himself to hope. Spring arrived definitively 3 days later. Emma's fever broke completely during the night, and she woke clear-eyed and asking for eggs. Grace laughed actual laughter. Bright and unguarded. "Eggs it is, then," she said, pulling on her coat to check the henhouse. Samuel watched from the table, warmth spreading through his chest. Emma sat propped in the rocking chair, wrapped in quilts but smiling. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her voice, though weak, carried its usual bright curiosity. "Tell me a story, Papa," she said, "about Mama's roses." Samuel told her about Catherine's determination to grow flowers in frontier soil, about seasons of failure and stubborn replanting. "Wishtai," Emma listened, rapt. And for the first time, the memories didn't cut quite so deep. Grace returned with eggs and fried them with the last of the salt pork. And Bichon nefai madon. They ate together. The three of them crowded around the small table, and the meal felt like celebration. "You'll be up and walking soon," Grace told Emma. But slowly. "No running for another week at least." "But I'm better now," Emma protested. "Better isn't fully healed." Grace's tone was firm but affectionate. "Patience, sweetheart." After breakfast, Grace began packing her saddlebags. The movements were methodical. Practiced herbs returned to pouches. Bottles wrapped carefully in cloth. Samuel watched from the doorway, dread building in his chest. "You're leaving," he said. Statement, not question. The work's done. Grace didn't look at him. Emma's on the mend. Your fence is repaired. My wood's chopped. The bargain's complete. Samuel's hands clenched at his sides. Everything in him wanted to protest, to find reasons for her to stay. But Grace had given him 3 weeks of her time and skills. The debt was settled. Except it wasn't about debt. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. Grace, he started, then stopped. What could he offer a struggling claim? A leaky cabin. A daughter and a grief-scarred heart. Grace finished packing and straightened. She looked at Samuel then, really looked, and he saw his own conflict mirrored in her weathered face. The land. Samuel blurted, "Half my claim. It's not much. But it's yours if you want it. Payment for saving Emma's life." Grace went very still. "Samuel, I know it's not enough. I know you've got your own homestead, but it's all I have to give." His voice roughened. "You gave me my daughter's life back. That's worth—" "Stop!" Grace crossed the cabin and took his hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, real. "Samuel, listen to me. I didn't come for payment. Not wood. Not fence mending. And certainly not land. Then why—" The question came raw. "Why stay 3 weeks for people you barely knew?" Grace's eyes filled. "Because I was lonely. Because when Tom mentioned a sick child and a widowed father, I saw a chance to be needed again. Because—" Her voice dropped to near whisper. Because I came for supper that first night and saw the way you loved your daughter, the way you'd do anything for her. And I thought, maybe there's room for me too, in that kind of love." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. "Grace, I don't want your land," she said firmly. "I want—" She stopped, seemed to gather courage. "I want what I've had these 3 weeks. A family. People to care for and be cared by. A home that's more than just walls." Emma, watching from her chair, smiled like she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Samuel found his voice. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not today, not—" He swallowed hard. "Not ever. If you'd consider staying." "As what?" Grace asked. But her eyes had gone soft. "Your hired help—" "As family." Samuel tightened his grip on her hand. "Not replacing Catherine, not trying to recreate what was, but building something new. The 3 of us." Grace's tears spilled over. "You mean that—" "I've never meant anything more." Samuel's own eyes stung. "These weeks you've been here, the cabin's been a home again. I've remembered how to hope, how to see worth in things beyond survival." He paused. "You did that. Not just the medicine. I call it." Grace stepped closer. "I'm not easy. Samuel, I'm set in my ways. Opinionated. I won't let you work yourself to death trying to prove worth you already have. I know. And I won't replace Emma's mother. I can't be Catherine. I'm not asking you to be—" "Then what are you asking?" Samuel's voice gentled. "To stay. To build a life with us. To be family. In whatever shape that takes." Grace searched his face. Weighing. Measuring. Then she nodded once. Decisive. I'll stay, she said, on one condition. Name it. We combine the homesteads, pool resources, work both claims. True partnership, not charity either direction. And Samuel felt his smile break through. Unexpected and genuine. Agreed. From her chair, Emma clapped weakly. Does this mean Miss Grace is staying forever? Grace laughed, wiping her eyes. Looks that way, sweetheart. Good, Emma said with satisfaction. I was hoping... Samuel pulled Grace close, not quite an embrace, but close enough to feel her warmth, her solidity, her realness. She fit against him differently than Catherine had, but no less right. Thank you, he murmured, for everything. Grace's hand came up to rest against his chest, over his heart. You already had worth, she whispered. I just helped you see it. Outside, snow melted in earnest, revealing earth ready for spring planting. Inside, 3 people who'd been alone had found their way to something better, family, not bound by blood, but by choice and care and the quiet courage to hope again. Spring settled over the Montana territory like a blessing. Within a week, Emma was walking short distances, regaining strength daily. Within 2, she was pestering to help with chores. Grace allowed small tasks, gathering eggs, folding linens, grinding herbs under supervision. Samuel and Grace established new rhythms. In Polynesia, mornings, he worked his claim while she tended the cabin and checked Emma. Afternoons, they rode to Grace's homestead together, combining herds and evaluating which land would best support crops. Like Bistek Tronchu. Evenings belonged to Emma's stories, lessons, simple suppers at the table. The gossip in town faded quicker than Samuel expected. When they rode to the settlement together for supplies, the community saw what they'd become, a family, forming naturally as seasons changed. The general store clerk nodded approval. The minister's wife smiled warmly. Even the doctor, when Samuel stopped to thank him for nothing, waved off the gratitude. I heard the widow Porter tended your girl. Doc Harrison said, Grace knows her business. You're in good hands. I am, Samuel agreed, meeting Grace's eyes across the store. Very good hands. On a warm afternoon 2 weeks after Emma's full recovery, Samuel rode to the settlement alone. He returned with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Grace without ceremony. She unwrapped it to find fabric simple cotton in soft blue. Enough for a dress. Her hands stilled on the cloth. It's not much, Samuel said. But I thought. He cleared his throat. I wanted to. Grace's eyes shone. It's perfect. Emma, watching from the doorway, grinned. Papa's courting you, Miss Grace. I can see that, Grace said, voice warm with amusement. Samuel ducked his head, embarrassed but not ashamed. If that's all right with you, more than all right. Oh. Grace folded the fabric carefully. Though I'm not much for fancy dresses. Good, because I can't afford fancy anyway. They smiled at each other, the exchange gentle and honest, courting at their age. With all they'd been through. Looked different than youthful romance, but it was no less real. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed in the loft, her old cot retired in favor of the space Samuel had slept. He and Grace sat by the fire. The lamp burned bright, oil replenished. The woodpile stood tall. The medicine shelf held Grace's carefully labeled remedies. I've been thinking, Grace said, hands busy with mending. About Catherine's roses. Samuel looked up from the harness he was repairing. What about them? Emma said she'd like to try planting them again. This spring. If we can find wild ones in the foothills. Samuel's chest tightened. You'd do that not to replace Catherine. Grace met his eyes. To honor her. She was Emma's mother. That matters. It does. Samuel agreed quietly. Thank you. Besides. Grace continued with a slight smile. I'm stubborn enough to make them grow properly. Samuel laughed. If anyone can, it's you. They returned to their work. Comfortable in the silence, outside. Night birds called. Inside. The fire crackled warm. Samuel, Grace said after a while, do you ever regret it? The bargain we struck? Never. He set aside the harness. Not a single day, even when I'm opinionated and set in my ways. Especially then. Samuel's expression softened. You showed me something I'd forgotten. That worth isn't about what you own or what you've lost. It's about what you do with what you have. How you show up for people. Grace nodded slowly. Jacob used to say that the measure of a man isn't his gold, but his grit. How he faces hard times. A smart man. He was. Grace's voice held old fondness without fresh pain. You would have liked him. I think I would have. Samuel paused. And I think Catherine would have liked you. The acknowledgement settled between them. Comfortable recognition that they carried their dead with honor. While building something new with the living, Emma's voice drifted down from the loft. Are you two going to talk all night? I'm trying to sleep. Sorry, sweetheart. Grace called up, amusement coloring her words. It's all right, Emma said. I like hearing you both down there. It's nice. Samuel and Grace exchanged glances. Nice was an understatement. The cabin that had been hollow with grief now brimmed with life, laughter, and conversation. Medicine smells and cooking aromas. The rustle of skirts and the sound of shared work. Later, after Grace had banked the fire and retired to her bedroll, though Samuel suspected that sleeping arrangement wouldn't last much longer, he stood at the window looking out at the spring night. Stars blazed overhead. The land stretched dark and vast. But the cabin behind him glowed warm with lamplight and purpose. He thought about his journey from widower drowning in grief to father accepting help to man daring to hope. Again, about Grace's own path from lonely widow to healer, to partner. About Emma, who'd faced fever and emerged stronger, gaining not just health, but a mother figure who loved her. Worth wasn't measured in coins or land. Grace had taught him that. It was measured in presence. In showing up day after day. In the choice to care and be cared for. In the courage to build family from love rather than blood alone. Samuel returned to the fire and knelt beside Emma's old cot, now pushed against the wall. Grace had washed and mended the quilts, prepared it for storage or future use. He touched the rough fabric, remembering nights of vigil and fear. Thank you, he whispered to whatever Grace had brought Grace Porter to his door that snow-heavy morning. Grace stirred in her bedroll. Did you say something? Just talking to myself. Samuel said, Well, stop it and get some sleep. Tomorrow we've got fence to mend at my place. Beep, our place. Samuel corrected gently. Grace's smile was audible in the darkness. Our place. Yes. And Samuel climbed to the loft where Emma slept peacefully, color in her cheeks and health in her breathing. He settled into his blankets and listened to the cabin breathe around him, two people he loved below. Spring, arriving outside. Hope unfurling like new leaves. They were home. All three of them. Not the home Samuel had known before. Not the one he'd imagined in those dark months after Catherine's death, but something better, built from shared work and honest need, and the quiet understanding that survival meant helping each other. Through hard country. Grace whispered what they all knew, her voice drifting up from below. We're home. Samuel closed his eyes and let peace settle over him like a warm quilt. Morning would bring work, it always did. He gnawed out outside, but also laughter and partnership and the thousand small moments that made a life, worth measured not in what he possessed, but in what he offered. Not in coins, but in presence. Not in perfection, but in showing up, day after day. For the people who mattered, the lamp burned bright. The door would open to spring air tomorrow, and the family they'd built from winter's hardship would face the new season together, whole, healed, home.